Hello, everyone. Uh, it's 3 p.m., so I'll let me start our workshop today. Greetings to everyone from Tallinn, where I'll be spending the next few days. A beautiful city, though it's raining outside, but yeah, I guess everybody in the Baltics is used to that kind of weather. Um, my name is Julius. I'm the CEO and co-owner of Cloudvisor, and we are hosting today's workshop on running serverless Django with Zappa. And I'm really happy that you decided to spend some time, especially during the summertime, to get deeper into this topic. And this workshop is specifically dedicated to the local AWS community, and this and a number of other events where we're running this with the aim just to grow the competence of people using AWS in Latvia and in Estonia and in Lithuania, and to also encourage everyone to share the knowledge, which a good example will be today of Klāvs sharing his experience with running some specific stuff on AWS. And actually we even have a special Slack channel for that, for the local AWS community, and I really recommend everyone here to join it, and I'll be sharing the link in the chat after we start. And yeah, like the local community, why does Cloudvisor care about it? So well, first of all, we're the local AWS partner in the Baltic states, so we're definitely like open to working with everyone that's using or is thinking about using AWS. And on the other side, like AWS resell is our main business line. So like from that perspective, the more you get out of AWS, the more you can use it in your business technology. So the better it is for us as well on that side. So, but getting back to the workshop, our host today, like I said, will be Klāvs from a very special and a nice startup from Latvia, Nordigen. And I guess he'll be sharing some details about himself in the intro. But before we start, just a few logistics details for us to like get started on the right foot. So first of all, the plan is to spend up to 2 hours on the workshop. We'll see how it goes and how much time it will take. Maybe we'll finish a bit sooner if the demo gods will be with us. There's a Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom environment. So please, all questions are very welcome. And the plan is to answer them at the end of the presentation. Though, of course, if you have some troubles, just write them down in the chat, and we'll do our best to help you out. And we'll be recording the workshop. So this means that we'll be sharing the recording with everyone after the event. So you can go through it once again. And hopefully you've seen in the emails we've sent that we have also training accounts ready for those who would like to go the whole hands-on experience together with Klāvs. So if you just need that, you see the email in the slide. So just if you decide to go with it, just drop us an email and we'll send the credentials right away. So that's I guess it from my side. Klāvs, are you ready to take over? Okay. Klāvs, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. Zoom, just as you stopped sharing, Zoom decided to go off screen and lost the controls for it. Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. And let me just share the screen so I get the presentation going. Right, so is that working? I'll take that
Yeah,
as a yes.
I see it. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So, right, so short things about me. Like I'm the head of infrastructure at Nordigen. We're a small, well, not that small anymore, fintech startup working in basically data analysis and enrichment for open banking. I've been a DevOps engineer for as far as I can remember, which is at least the last 5 years, and working with AWS for the same amount of time. And I also happen to be a total geek. Right, and more about the things that we're actually going to be touching upon. It's AWS Lambda, which is their serverless implementation. Serverless being in quotes, since they're still servers. It's just that you're not managing them. That's handled all the way through by AWS, in comparison to something like EC2, where you still manage the software side of the hardware. We're also going to be looking at Zappa, which is kind of a framework that allows you to package and deploy existing Python applications into Lambda. So that means you don't actually have to change the code. You have to initialize Zappa in it, and you can use it to do various functions within the Lambda environment. We're also going to be touching upon Dynaconf, which is dynamic environment management package for Python. And the reason for that is because it allows you to have really convenient external config management. For example, you can have your configuration in Redis, secrets stored in Vault, and the like. So there's no real lock-in in the environments, so you're not reliant on an individual piece of tech, yet you can still leverage the fact that you're running in Lambda, and you can use it together with the other AWS hosted tools such as Redis. So it's pretty convenient. Another thing is that's not here. But that's more or less the main outline of what we're going to be touching upon. Like, we're not going to be going all the way into each individual piece, because that would probably take more than a couple of hours. But what we're going to be doing today is basically a simple touch-up on each of those pieces and basically deploying an application in various stages of its existence on Lambda. Right, so if everybody is ready, then maybe we can actually start with that. And maybe you can post in the chat if you need a couple of minutes setting up the environment still. As the email was sent out, I believe that the expectation is that if you want to join in on the hands-on experience, that you have basically the GitHub repo. I can actually post it in chat, downloaded, which, okay, that's refusing to open, so I'll just do it from the other browser. And where do you get chat? Ah, there. All right. So, assuming that everybody has that repo downloaded, the first thing we're gonna do is basically just pull out the base folder, and that's mostly what we're going to be working with. The other ones are basically just like snapshots of the various stages, just in case later you need to look back at something or the like for examples, but mainly we're just going to be using the first one. So we're just going to copy the first folder into basically anything as long as it doesn't have the numbers, because the numbers mess a bit with the environment naming that's gotten automatically by Zappa. So let's just say workshop. Workshop, if you look at the code, then it's actually fairly basic Django application. It just has the config module that is practically just a bare initialized Django application, and we have a simple pages module that has a single view saying hello world. So nothing complicated, so that we can just keep it simple today. Right, and once we're in there, the only thing we need to do is basically activate the pip environment and install the Django. So let's start with that. So with that, you can just run pip and install Django. We specify a bit of an older version simply because to get a later version running, you have to do a bit of fiddling. It's nothing complicated, but just so that we don't bug down the workshop with that, we keep it to an older version. We run that, and that automatically creates the pip environment and adds Django as a dependency. It takes a short moment to get it up and running. Right, and while that's happening, we can look at the code that just adds, or at least I guess we'll add later the pip file to the application. Right, so it installs it. We run pip and shell, and it opens the virtual environment already. Right, so we have a virtual environment with Django. Since it's a super basic application, we can just test it, run python manage py, and run server. And we have the application running. Here it's just complaining that we haven't run the migrations, which would be something that's needed in an actual application, but considering right now we are just running a basic hello world example, then that's not really needed. And we can check that it's running, and yeah, it is. But that's just the part where we get it running locally. Now to actually get it up and running in Lambda, all we have to do is run pip install Zappa. Which grabs a couple of dependencies along with Bota, so it can actually interact with AWS. That also takes a short moment. And if I hope nobody is having issues following this, but if you are, just post it in chat. Or if you need larger font size or something like that.
Yeah, so far the chat is pretty quiet. So hopefully everybody is doing good. Or
Yeah, that should be the safer assumption, or optimistic rather. Since it does have a fair few dependencies, it does take a moment. But the good news is that once that is done, any kind of interactions are fairly quick. And just to reiterate, we also need to have your credentials installed already in AWS configuration. So in case you haven't done that, there's still time. Easiest way to do it is just run AWS configure if you have the AWS CLI. If not, go into your home directory, make a .aws directory, and in the create a config file with the credentials. I'll not show that since I don't want to screen share credentials, but if you need any help with that, just post it. Okay, so we have Zappa installed, and the highly complicated way of getting it up and running is just running Zappa init, which will ask you for some default configuration. For the most part, we can leave it to its defaults. Like first part asks what kind of environments you need. You can specify multiple ones. For now, let's stick to just the basic development one. Here it asks which profile you want to use. That pulls already from the AWS profile configuration. So in this case, it's the default one for me. If you have a differently named profile one, specify that. And then it asks for what kind of bucket you want to use. Here you can specify the config, like the bucket that will be used for the file storage, which is used in the meantime. And I see that somebody is asking for the template. Just a second, I'll post it. I'll post it in chat.
Klāvs, I see a question from Ilya.
Yeah, I'm already answering that. I'll just writing it up in chat. For some reason, it spaced out. You might also want to add a region there. So say EU West 1. Ignore the white space, but otherwise that should be enough. And then you can leave it as the default config. Right, so back to that. Right, so the bucket isn't actually used that much, so the name isn't important unless you like to name it. Have the S3 buckets clean and easily understandable, but you can also just leave it to the defaults. The bucket is mainly used for that moment where Zappa packages the application, uploads it to S3, and from that the Lambda image is built, and afterwards the bucket itself and content is removed. So we can leave it to the default one. And then the final question is basically asking for the Python project's configuration and modules the file or specification. And Zappa has some logic to detect the type of application it is. So if it would be a Flask one, I'll finish that. If it's a Flask one, it would detect that. If not, then you can specify whatever, because it also works with basic Python applications as well. And I see, Ilya, what do you not see there? Like the, right, I did not answer. I answered to panelists, not everybody. Sorry. There. Do you see it now? Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, and as we can see in the case of Django, it automatically detects the right one, and we can just use the default one as well. And yeah, here you can deploy it globally, which for most cases, unless it's some kind of high-profile production application, is not actually necessary. And in this case, definitely not necessarily, since it drives up the costs of it, and hence why also the default option is not to deploy it globally. Right, and what it does is create this simple configuration file that if we leave it and go look at code, that open here, we can see already it creates this file. And what it is basically a simple definition of the various environments. And the region is automatically pulled from your profile if it's defined. If not, it would ask for it. And sets the profile name, which again is the AWS profile, the name of the project, which is why we actually renamed the folder, because that's the default one where it pulls it from. But any of this can be renamed. Runtime is pulled from what you are, the virtual environment you're running when executing the initialization, and the bucket. There are other things that can be specified here, and we'll get on that later. But for now, we have the simple dev environment definition. So let's try deploying it. Deploying it is also intricately complicated. It's Zappa, deploy, and then the environment, which in this case is dev. So what it does now, it creates the IAM roles that will be used by Lambda and also for the purpose of creating all the surrounding things, which the S3 bucket, the API gateway, and the Lambda itself. Then it also packages the application, which is collecting all the dependencies, and uploads it. Now, see, it's fairly quick, but now we will face a little problem in the sense that if we open it, it will not actually run. And that is simply because Django has the default built-in security measure that you actually need to specify what hosts are allowed. But that's not a particularly big problem because it actually specifies that you need to add this to allowed hosts. Now we just copy the URL and go into the project directory and go to config, settings, and here you have the allowed hosts part, and here you simply in single quotes copy in the allowed host save it. And now we can also see how updating works, which is Zappa update dev environment. And the difference in update is that it doesn't actually touch the API gateway or anything. It simply repackages the application with made changes and uploads it and deploys to Lambda. Which also takes a moment, but here we are. No, basically the URL shouldn't have changed. And if we refresh it, boom, we have a running Django application in Lambda. Now, one of the nice things that you can also do with it is actually see the logs, which is easy as Zappa tail and again environment. And boom, and you have, and you can pull the CloudWatch logs directly through the CLI. So for instance, previously, if something is not working, you can already find it in the logs directly. You don't even have to open it. Well, you would have to open it for it to trigger it, but you have easy access to the actual logs here, which would be something you need if you have disabled the debug state, for example. And if I'm not mistaken, this also actually is real time. So while you're running it, it keeps updating the logs as they come in. So it's quite handy for debugging certain things. And the tail function also has filter options, so you can filter out for specific logs, which is quite handy. For example, if you wanted to filter out for specifically HTTP related logs, you can run Zappa tail dev and you specify what kind of logs. So, and there you get only the HTTP responses and not actually the content, and that also works in reverse by specifying non-HTTP. So it's not exactly something that you'll be using most likely in production, since, well, you at that point you should have some kind of log management and that sort of things. But for simply debugging while playing around with dev environment or making some changes, it's quite handy to have such easy access to readable logs. Right. Does Zappa support gradual blue-green canary deployment models? It supports it in the sense not inherently, but you can work around it by deploying to having the separation of environments and having then some form of load balancer or additional logic onto it, but directly doesn't handle it, no. Right. So with that, we actually got through Zappa. And now on to the next part, which will be adding the configuration management and getting it in the project is slightly more involved than running a single command. It's two, but the installation process is the same. You simply run pip install dynaconf. Now, which I did on the wrong screen. Sorry about that. Right, and for this initialization, you actually have to specify which file you're, like what settings file is used in your application. For that, we simply specify it by exporting it as a variable, by exporting Django settings module. And then in our case, the settings module, the application module's name is config and settings. And once that's run, we should be able to simply run dynaconf init. And boom, this already detects the settings. And there, we run it, and it already adds its hook, basically. And the way it looks is if we go in the project, if we open the settings file, if we go to the bottom, what it adds is basically these two lines, along with the comments on both sides. So what it does, it basically kind of hijacks the settings configuration and injects itself into Django's setting format. So in the eyes of Django, nothing has changed, but in the context of managing it, you now have the manage, the settings config, settings.toml, but also there's support for different formats depending how you install it. So, for instance, we can also add additional config formats by installing the dynaconf like extra packages. For instance, we can install dynaconf YAML, which adds extra dependencies to the dynaconf package to the project in the context of dynaconf, simply for parsing YAML in this case. But it also supports Python files, and there's various external ones as well. It supports Redis and Vault, and two separate formats of settings as well, because you can use it also for secret management and separately for config management. So for instance, in a production format, you could use Redis for the configuration management so that it's completely decoupled from the application itself, and Redis for some form of secret storage, for HashiCorp Vault for secret storage, where you can inject whatever kind of secrets you would need, like the going as far as, for example, injecting the Django secret key, which in this case we're sharing because we're not really running it in production, but that's fairly handy because one of the drawbacks of not managing your own system, as is the case with Lambdas, you have to kind of work around that. Or you could use the default Lambda environments, but then you're kind of stuck in the Lambda specific world. If you're using something like this, you can use your external configuration, which can then be reused if you're, for instance, deploying to EC2 at a later time and your architecture doesn't change. Or you can mix and match depending on your needs. Or say just use Lambda for like running certain functions of your overall bigger project. Now in our case, the way we can test it is add the settings.yaml file. The way the configuration is formatted is also environmental. So you can set for the application itself what environment it is, and based on that it will pull in various configs. So you, in this case we just stick to default and say add debug false. Right. And again, we run Zappa update. Dev, and now it should package as well Dynaconf into the dependencies. It first packages it. And slowly uploads it. Right. Well, we won't actually be seeing that the bug state is broken, disabled, because we're not really breaking the package, but we can do that again. And meanwhile, at least I can check if the application is still running, which it is. So dependencies should have been added. Now, how do we check that the debug is actually broken? Let's just, for instance, take the page and add some broken request to it. And we update the page. And it failed mainly because it's a slightly too broken one. But if we look at the logs, it's actually failing to start completely because the formatting is bad. But which also shows that here we can actually see that the debug state is not enabled, because if it would be, we can test the difference. So go away. Change it to true, update. Okay, and here we can see that the debug gets enabled again. And that's quite handy, even working with working while developing it, because you have a clear format that's reusable across the board, and you have the choice of using whatever kind of format and the central location you want for the config itself. And since you can use Python or Django, any kind of that formatting, you can have actual and proper logic in the dynamic settings as well, and even templating based on various settings or environments between the deployments, which can be quite useful, especially if you're deploying, generating various environments where you don't really want to manage the configuration. It can be auto-generated and deployed that way, so you're not even touching the settings manually, which can of course be achieved by the basic settings as well, but this way at least you can centralize it, and irrelevant of the Python kind of framework or whatever you're using, have the same coherent setting structure. And then for the last part on how to actually set up different environments, it's more or less as simple. If we don't want to initialize, then we can simply copy this. Remember to add the comma. Change the environment name to say stage. The rest of the settings mostly stay the same, except can change the bucket to say Zappa stage, or actually even the bucket can stay the same because it handles that logic. So for more complications, like we could configure the environments here and have the different settings based on these environments already in the logic, but we're not going to be doing that today. And if we now run Zappa deploy stage, it already starts creating another API gateway, another Lambda role, complete isolation from the previous role. So in this case, the only thing that's connecting them is basically the S3 buckets that they use for deployment, which you can still separate if you need to. You can also deploy with into VPCs with Zappa, but again, it's a bit more complicated. But it's the importance is on the term a little bit, because really nothing about it is that complicated, and it's really simple to use. Just like Dynaconf, the only problem with Dynaconf is if you already have existing configurations with some kind of complicated logic, then it might be a bit more difficult transferring it over, but it's still very possible, and the benefits are there, and at least in my opinion, worth it. And again, now we have the separate environment. Which will have the same issue as before, that it's not enabled in allowed hosts, because as it's a different environment, it has a different host name. And regarding the host names, they can also be changed, and Zappa actually supports automatic certificate generation if you have configured domains. it supports both AWS cert manager certificates and also Let's Encrypt ones. And it handles that almost automatically. You just, for cert manager context, you have to have the domain enabled in the, I think it's North Virginia 1 region, because that's the one that majority of AWS services. For different environments, you can specify in whichever config language that you're using, you can specify a dev debug true, stage debug false, and whatever else, and then depending if it's some specific environment, it will first pull in the default ones, and then if there's anything environment specific, then it will use those to override or set the new variables. And that, for the most part, is it from the actual technical stuff. We can move on to the opinion use cases. Like the way I see it, the main use cases are the fact that you can quickly get it up. Like, as you saw, the amount of work needed to get up the environment is not very long. You can get up existing projects for the most part fairly quickly. It has, Zappa specifically has some issues in that it depends on pre-packaged packages, because Lambda out of the box does not support everything. So you have to build some certain libraries, which in the case of Zappa, for the majority part is actually already done, but there are some exemptions. Like the reason we are using Django 2 is because the SQLite package that they're using is somewhat outdated, but it's not super complicated to both build and package the library yourself. And then you can like all of it's in GitHub, and you can see how the logic, how it does that and work around it, or use Postgres, or which is actually another thing. Yeah, you can use different database connections as well. The only caveat to that is that the more kind of external dependencies you're using, the more latency you're going to have, because the way Lambda works is that for the most part, it's dead while not in use. So what Zappa does already is it creates also keep alive functions, or keep warm in the case of Lambda, so that it every 4 minutes calls the Lambda so that it's considered warm and active, which by default lowers the latency to it. And so back to the use cases, it can be also used for quick demos, scalable applications that are not super intensively used constantly. If you have applications that are constantly used, I would say it's a better choice to go with something like EC2 or Elastic Beanstalk, unless you're very, very strapped for development resources, mainly because Lambda can get expensive if you have very intense constant usage, because as it scales, a single Lambda instance runs one connection, and if more connections come up, well, that's while one's already running, it spins up another Lambda, and that can add up if you have constant pressure. But if you have the case where you can sometimes at peak times just get sudden bursts of requests, then it's still usually, well, up to a certain point can be cheaper than running dedicated EC2 instances. And you don't really have to worry about the scaling that much up to a point, because I think out of the box, Lambda has the scaling limits to, I think, 1,000 instances at the same time. And if you need more, you need to request AWS to extend that limit. Also, another thing, use case that you can run with Zappa, you can set up also scheduling, where basically you create the Lambda, it creates the Lambda for you, and you specify a function to use within your application. And then you can schedule the Lambda to run at specific times and to execute only that one specific function. For that can be used, for example, to do some kind of database migrations, exporting data from your application, truncating data, pretty much anything that you need a cron for. And in this case, it's cron in an environment that once it's running, you don't have to touch it because it will just keep on running. And also it's fairly good for like quick starting these kind of projects, since again, if you're running this format, you're not actually writing Lambda code, you're making a Django, Flask, whatever native Python application that can run on Lambda. So you can, in early phases, just run on Lambda, and once you grow, swap to EC2 with practically no issues. Just looking at your question, Rainis. Yeah, with the different settings, you can pretty much change all the configurations. So you have environment 1, environment run uses SQLite. It has the dev config and all the debug enabled. Test 2 is using Postgres or MySQL database. So you can run different environments, like different backend configurations without any kind of issues. And for config as well, you can have environment 1 using files or local environment variables, or and the second environment using Redis as the configuration source. So for use cases, I guess that's the main part. And actually, we've gone through fairly quickly. And I guess we can officially go to the Q&A direction. So if you have more questions, then feel free to bring it up.
Yeah, I saw that the Q&A went pretty well in the chat as well. Yeah, but like if anybody has more use case or anything, use the occasion and then shoot them. I'm sure Klāvs will be happy to answer all of those, not only like specific technical questions, but maybe some use cases or scenarios like Rainis did.
Yeah, and also nice to see that we have Daniil here as well, since
Yeah, our presenter from the last workshop.
yeah, and indirect inspiration to all of this as such.
Yeah, as while we're waiting for the questions, I can also add that yeah, like I think it's very nice that the community event is being hosted by the members of the community. So if anybody here would like to take the same role as Klāvs is doing today, or Daniil was doing a few weeks ago, so just let me know, and I'm sure we can set this up. And I don't know, Klāvs, maybe you most probably would say the same, that like any like knowledge sharing or workshops from the companies and people you know or that share the similar view or background, it's way more interesting than just, I don't know, official AWS
No, without a doubt, because like in these cases, like this is not marketing for anything. This is tech that we find interesting and useful. So there's no ulterior motives to this. Like specifically for this tech, the only reason is really because I think it's actually kind of cool, and it's the Lambda combination is kind of a fringe-ish use case for Django, because that's not usually the way to go, but I find it as an interesting approach that can come in handy in certain cases.
Okay, I see no more questions coming. So, what do you think? Maybe we can then officially start the wrap up of the workshop, or is there anything like from the agenda? Oh, I see.
Yes, yeah. Like, how far have you gotten? Or like, depending on how many people are interested, we can. If you're the only one, we can do a one-on-one afterwards as well. But specifically for the settings, you initialize Dynaconf, and what might have been missed is that I missed myself in doing is, oh, right, I paused the sharing. Changes config by. Okay, so first install the Dynaconf. What I missed was that you actually need to install the YAML one, which is specified through the extension format, like that. That installs also the support for YAML. Then if we need to export the specification of what is the location of your config settings, which is, I can copy paste it in chat. And then you need to run Dynaconf init in the root of the project folder. So that will be the folder where you have your manage by. And in this case, in my case, it will complain that it already exists, but that's not a problem. Just you might want to check in your config if it actually updated the settings by. Should be on the last line. You should have this. Nobody else has any questions? Guess not.
I guess you did a good job of answering them along the way.
Yeah.
So then, you know, I guess we can. Okay, still, yeah, some questions.
Like if you don't, we can contact afterwards and talk one-on-one with Ilya.
Yeah.
Ilya, are you on the Slack community Slack? If you're on the community Slack, you can just write me up and we can go through it together. Probably easier to do it. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So it will be like a good excuse for to join the Slack channel. Yeah, and then Klāvs is there, and then you can follow up on the details.
Haha, got some sneaky marketing in after all.
Yeah, good work, Klāvs. Yeah, so yeah, first of all, I guess, I guess both from my side and then of all the attendees, thanks, Klāvs, for preparing this and running. I know it's not that easy to do such things, especially the demo gods are not always that favorable, and then even have running this for an hour is really most probably took way more time than now to see all the options. So yeah, thanks once again, and as I mentioned before to everybody else, if you want to follow Klāvs' example, just reach out to me. I'll leave my contacts at the very end, and I'm sure we can work something out for you to also present and show something to the local community. Klāvs was very good at reminding of the Slack channel. So that's already covered. And before we close, feedback is very important, I guess, for everybody that helped out in preparing this workshop. So I'll be just sharing a poll, so please just give your feedback on how you like the workshop, and that would be very useful for us on preparing for the ever workshop. And also in the Slack channel, or just in the follow-up email that we'll be sending out, if you have any ideas or topics that should be covered in similar events in the future, just let us know, and it's way easier for us to decide what to do next if we get some feedback and ideas from you. Okay, I see only 2 people voted now. Come on, guys.
Well, there's only 7 people here altogether, not counting us.
Okay, let's wait a few moments more. Okay, but still, the feedback is pretty clear. I'll just be sharing the results. Klāvs, do you see them as well? Everybody? Yep. Yeah, so I think it went well. The feedback is also quite good. So looking forward to seeing everybody here once again. Any farewell words from you, Klāvs?
Well, thanks for the opportunity for this, and as you already mentioned, if anybody has ideas of maybe if you'd like to see something more in depth or some kind of specific use case, reach out.
Yeah. And then let's keep in touch in the Slack as well, on everyday issues. I guess there should be some interesting stuff. We just need to get started as a community, like in the other countries, and there's plenty of stuff around AWS that can be discussed. So have a nice rest of the evening. We saved almost 1 hour of your time you booked. Yay! Let's keep in touch, and then have a great summer, everybody. Bye.
All right. Bye, guys.